The US power grid is dying. The $50 trillion water lie that's killing America's energy. The call came at 4:12 p.m. on a 108-degree afternoon. Not fuel, not a blown transformer. Intake temp just tripped the limit. In the next 6 hours, 2 million people would feel that sentence. A 900-megawatt plant eased the throttle while demand climbed. Hospital chillers waited on permission. A data center eyed its diesel tanks. Everyone expected wires to be the problem. They weren't. Here's the part nobody says out loud. The grid's choke point wasn't electrons. It was water, too warm, too low, and fenced by permits. The river set the ceiling. The city kept pushing, and the clock wouldn't stop. The grid runs on water, not energy. To understand why that call mattered, go back to the machine behind most US electricity. A heat engine that boils water into steam, spins a turbine, then needs a cold sink to condense that steam and reset. About 9 out of 10 kilowatt-hours still come from thermoelectric machines, coal, gas, nuclear, living and dying by that condensing step. No cold sink, no cycle. No cycle, no power. Here's the lie. We talk fuels and technologies like they float above geography, gas versus wind, nuclear versus solar. We almost never do the cooling math. Withdrawal versus consumption, once through intakes versus recirculating towers, intake limits, discharge limits, and ambient temperature lines written into permits. Planning models assume water arrives, cold and plentiful, exactly when you need it. That assumption is breaking. Action first. Once through systems can withdraw hundreds of thousands to millions of gallons per minute, sending most of it back a few degrees warmer. Recirculating systems withdraw far less, but evaporate more through towers. Either way, the heat has to leave. In ordinary summers, it does. Under a heat dome, the intake water starts near the red line, river flow slackens, and the legal temperature rise aloud above ambient shrinks to tenths of a degree. Operators can't argue with a permit that protects fisheries and downstream users. They throttle or they trip. What nobody priced into capacity spreadsheets was how geography locks risk. Dense clusters of thermal capacity sit on the Ohio and Tennessee, the lower Colorado, the Columbia, and on coasts tied to marine protections. As those watersheds warm, dry, and swing between low flows and flash floods, the dependable middle of the fleet becomes seasonal. Reliability planning that treated water as a constant runs into summers that don't cool at night, towers that underperform in hot, humid air, and rivers that never reset before the next peak. Finance noticed, a plant that can't run hard during the most lucrative hours because intake temperatures exceed permits or flows fall below thresholds becomes a stranded asset in slow motion. Capacity payments erode when accredited summer capacity gets cut to reflect water risk. Insurance tax on riders for environmental curtailments. Lenders ask different questions. What were intake temperatures the last 3 summers? How much headroom under 316? Discharge limits. What's the basin's 5-year drought outlook? Regulatory planning has a blind spot. Capacity accreditation and seasonal assessments often treat water as static, but hydrology moved. Heat waves arrive earlier, linger longer. Nights don't cool enough for condensers and transformers to recover. Rivers start warm and stay warm. The constraint repeats exactly when demand stretches later into the evening. Meanwhile, high temperatures drop line ratings and shave transfer capability, compounding the pinch. Make it human. You hear it when a hospital facility's chief asks, "Can you hold frequency for 6 minutes while we restart chillers?" The operator checks an intake thermometer, not a gas contract. Downriver, a grower staring at allocation cuts sees posted withdrawals from a power station and wants to know why electrons outrank crops. A fisheries biologist measures stress in trout at a discharge plume while the plant trims load to keep a 1-degree delta. Nobody in those scenes argues about megawatt pricing models. They argue about a river. Inside water use, the terms hide trade-offs. Withdrawal isn't consumption. Returning warmer water alters ecology. Evaporation in towers cuts withdrawals but consumes scarce supply. In a hot, dry year, both paths fail. Rivers too warm to accept discharge, air too hot to reject heat effectively, minimum flows that leave nothing spare. Physics and permits converge into the same ceiling. This is where the story bends. Drought maps now overlap with a big share of thermal capacity. Operators pre-plan derates, their word for planned output cuts, at the exact hours demand peaks. Hot days lead to hot nights kill recovery, and the next day starts with less headroom. The feedback loop tightens across a week-long heat dome. Add hydropower's late summer thinness, head falls, inflows shift earlier, and the quiet battery flickers when you need it as a ramping resource. Reliability turns into choreography. Staggered chillers, pre-cooled buildings, peakers on standby, emergency imports if the lines can carry. If you zoom out, the point isn't anti-thermal or pro-renewable. It's pro-reality. A grid that treats rivers and oceans as infinite cold sinks will keep getting surprised by thermometers and flow gauges. The overlooked question is, do we have fuel? Do we have cold water where and when we're allowed to use it? In more places, more often, the answer is no, or not enough. So who knew? Plant engineers have watched condenser backpressure creep on hot nights for decades. Environmental monitors have logged fish stress and thermal plumes. Regulators wrote permit lines using historical ambient temperatures. Investors ran discounted cash flows without a river column. Everyone saw a slice. Few stitched it into a grid-wide dependency. That's the lie unmasked. The US grid runs on water. When the water runs hot or runs low, the grid shrinks, even with fuel in the yard and gas in the pipe. The control room at 4:12 p.m. wasn't staring at a generator fault. They were staring at a river thermometer, and that's the meter that decides who gets the cold when August shows up. Evidence deep dive. Water withdrawals by technology and basin. To see the choke points, follow the water. Start with cooling design. Once through systems pull staggering volumes, hundreds of thousands to millions of gallons per minute, move heat through condensers, then return it warmer. Withdrawals are huge, consumption is low. Recirculating systems withdraw a fraction of that, but evaporate far more through towers. Withdrawals drop, consumption rises. Dry and hybrid assist/water needs, but pay in efficiency, especially on hot days when air cooling struggles. Under heat domes, each design hits a different wall. Rivers too warm to accept discharge, towers with poor approach temperatures, or dry systems giving up megawatts to stay within limits. Now put that physics on a map. In the Colorado River Basin, the math is measured in feet. Hydropower depends on head, the vertical drop, and inflow timing. When Lake Powell sits high, Glen Canyon's turbines bite. When elevations flirt with minimum power pool near 3,490 feet, generation falters. Federal outlooks have warned. In dry scenarios by late 2026, Powell can approach that line. Mead near 1,035 feet would force Hoover to shed roughly 70% of capacity as 12 of 17 units go quiet. Contracts that once felt firm now hinge on snowpack and heat. That's electricity priced by winter storms and summer air. While that was playing out in the Southwest, the Southeast learned that wide, slow rivers aren't infinite sinks. Once through coal and gas units saw intake temperatures push toward permit limits. Some states cap both absolute discharge temperature and the allowed rise above ambient, especially during low flow or spawning windows. Recirculating units helped on withdrawals, but still stumbled when humid nights kept air hot and towers underperformed. Operators derated across stretches of days, exactly when evenings demanded full output. The biology behind those permits, dissolved oxygen stress, species protection, turned into the dispatch order. Meanwhile, the Midwest carried a quieter dependency. Along the Ohio and Tennessee rivers, a dense belt of gas-combined cycles and legacy units share the same water. On hot, low-flow weeks, a 1-degree rise allowed for Plant A becomes the starting point for Plant B downstream. Legal temperature ladders compress until the last unit in line has no headroom. The result isn't a dramatic trip. It's a corridor losing a virtual power plant through dozens of 5% trims. On the coasts, the ocean looks bottomless until marine heat waves and biology intervene. Coastal nuclear and gas plants gain resilience on flow but meet warm anomalies, jellyfish and algal blooms that clog screens, and tight marine discharge criteria. Diablo Canyon has ridden those margins during warm ocean years, proving that near the sea isn't free cooling. Inland nuclear units face dual constraints, discharge temperature caps and minimum flow rules that tie their intakes to river health. The paradox is simple: Nuclear is steady until its sink is. Numbers anchor this. Nationally, thermoelectric plants account for a large share of withdrawals, historically on the order of tens of % of all freshwater use, with once-through designs dominating that signature. Recirculating slashes withdrawals by an order of magnitude but bumps consumption. Gas-combined cycles, more efficient than coal, still run the same condenser physics, they just hit the wall later. Hydropower's water use is different, it passes flow, but energy depends on head and timing. Early snowmelt shifts spring peaks forward, late summer thinness arrives just when demand crests. Wind and solar barely register on the water ledger during operation, which is why they keep running when rivers warm, but their value shows up only if transmission and storage reshape the timing. Permits make the physics binding. Under the Clean Water Act Section 316, intake structures must protect aquatic life and discharges must stay within thermal criteria designed around historical ambient water. When rivers arrive at 86 degrees, the allowed rise may be a few tenths. Plants trim load preemptively to avoid violating limits that trigger enforcement and lawsuits. Insurance now writes business interruption clauses for environmental constraints. Lenders price sites by recent intake temperatures, discharge headroom, and basin drought outlooks. Water moved from background to credit risk. You can read the evidence in plant logs. Heat waves have pushed units on the Tennessee and Ohio to schedule maintenance that conveniently overlaps with permit-pinched afternoons. Nuclear stations inland have feathered 5% to keep condenser back pressure under safety bands. Out west, run-of-river hydro sagged in August as inflows lagged, while reservoir operators timed releases to protect elevations and fish before peaking power. None of it is ideology, it's the record of gauges and signatures. One detail matters for what's coming: accredited capacity versus paper nameplate. Market's historically credited average performance. Seasonal accreditation now trims summer value for plants on warm rivers unless they harden, hybrid cooling, wastewater tie-ins, or proven performance under heat. A combined cycle with a purple pipe contract earns back megawatts others lose. A coal unit with once-through cooling on a warming river sees its August promise discounted. A solar plus storage site gains because it delivers at dusk without touching a river at all. Zoom back to the map. 5 clusters light up. Desert Southwest load islands tied to the Colorado's head and feet. ERCOT's reservoir tethered thermals amid surging demand. The Ohio-Tennessee belt where warm, shared rivers turn small derates into big losses. The Southeast's humid, hot corridors with nuclear anchors. And the Northwest's late summer hydro thinness colliding with regional heat. Different basins, same story. The sink writes dispatch. And when the sink runs hot, the grid runs short. The human stake when lights and water collide. By 3:06 p.m., the hospital's facilities chief had the checklist open and a knot in his stomach. The chiller restart would spike load for 6 minutes. If frequency dipped at the wrong second, an OR mid-procedure would feel it. He called the control room. "Can you hold me steady?" The operator glanced at the intake thermometer edging up in tenths. "Start slow. Stage pumps at 30-second intervals. We'll ride with you." He relayed it to the OR. A scrub nurse paused, gloved hands lifted, listening for a yes that wasn't absolute. Crosstown, the data center's ops lead walked the battery aisles, hand on a rail that vibrated like a heartbeat. Their contract promised 5 nines. The grid didn't. Cooling setpoints dropped 2 degrees to build buffer, workloads shifted to another region over a congested link. He checked the diesel tanks and hated the thought, burn fuel because a river ran hot. A developer pinged him, inference latency spiking. He typed back, "Hold, grid's tight. We'll throttle before we fire gens." He knew if the needle nudged higher, the decision flipped. Downriver, a grower in his 60s watched his phone buzz with the day's allocation cut. He'd torn out a block of peaches last spring after a decade of drought stretches, and the stumps still stood like gravestones. On his laptop, a utility page scrolled plant withdrawals in millions of gallons per hour. He tapped the screen. "They're upstream, we're downstream, and we both need cold." His daughter, who ran the books, opened the power bill from last August, circled the peak charges, and said what neither wanted to say. "If prices climb again, we idle the new pump. We lose the late harvest." 3 days earlier, the town's water superintendent signed a boil water notice after algae blooms slipped through as the intake warmed. He rinsed a clogged screen while the mayor asked if the power plant could chip in for extra chemicals. "They're within permit," the superintendent said, "but we pay when the river heats." Residents held glasses under taps and frowned at the tint. On social feeds, the outage map and the boil water map overlapped in the same neighborhoods. At 4:21, the first residential feeders hit thermal alarms. Developers had sold glass-faced condos that cooked by late afternoon. Window units rattled like they were begging. In a third-floor walk-up, an 81-year-old woman shut off her bedroom AC and sat by the kitchen fan to keep the bill under control. Her fixed income didn't stretch with scarcity pricing. She'd grown up in the 1950s when the river was a backdrop and the plant a town landmark. Now the plant's warm discharge and her humming fan felt like the same story told two ways. Back in the control room, the analogies turned into choices. Voluntary conservation alert, sent, demand response, activated, big box stores dimmed aisles, a cement kiln paused a batch, a cold storage warehouse pre-chilled last night to coast now. Peakers with air cooling, spun up expensive and loud. Imports, limited, lines ran hot and sagged in the heat. The operator called the hospital back. "You're clear through 5 minutes. After that, we'll need 30 to reset." The chief nodded, then walked to the OR. "Go." Unknown to most watching price charts, a fisheries biologist stood knee-deep below the discharge, testing dissolved oxygen, while the plant shaved a little more to keep the delta inside the line. He called the environmental monitor. "Stress is high but survivable if your outlet stays under the cap." That phrase, "under the cap," was now the break on an entire city's evening. The data center hit its threshold at 4:37. The ops lead chose the lesser sin: start the gens for a 90-minute run, keep racks cool, avoid a cascade. Diesel fumes trusted over a warm river. He logged the start with a note nobody outside would see: grid constrained by intake temp. By dusk, the human seams were visible. A nurse taped foil over a west window in a clinic waiting room. A farmer shut the well. A mayor signed an emergency purchase order for treatment chemicals. A grandmother swapped rooms to chase a cross breeze. The operator circled numbers no fuel contract could fix: the thermometer in the river, the inches of head at the dam, the approach temperature at every tower, and understood the fight. The lights weren't arguing with electrons, they were bargaining with cold. The historical context, the origin of the water blind spot. To get why a river thermometer can stall a city, go back to when the grid's map was drawn with rail lines and cold water. After World War II, utilities followed a simple rule: put big machines where fuel arrives and cooling is free. Coal moved by train. Rivers and lakes looked endless. Land beyond city limits was cheap. Through the 195s, 196s, and 197s, that logic scaled into fleets, massive steam cycles planted on broad, dependable waters. Nobody questioned the sink. The sink made it possible. Regulation blessed the pattern. State commissions approved plants that matched rising load. The Clean Water Act arrived in the 197s, and permits set discharge and intake rules that engineers could meet with once through intakes, or, if neighbors and fish pushed back, with recirculating towers. If you had a big, cold river, once through was efficient and cheap. If you didn't, you bought a tower and paid the heat rate penalty. The choice wasn't about climate, it was about local politics and cost curves. Nuclear joined with a promise: smoke-free giant, steady, but nuclear is still steam. It traded coal piles for fuel assemblies, not condensers for magic. Siting had flexibility on fuel logistics, but cooling didn't. Many reactors landed on rivers and lakes that looked stable and cold. Their economics favored low condenser temperatures, which reinforced the siting bias. The assumption, rarely spoken, always embedded, was that ambient water would track the past. The 198s and 199s kept planning on typical summers. Hydropower told a parallel story that boosted confidence. Hoover, Glen Canyon, Grand Coulee, big dams packaged water management and electricity as one modern system: flood control, irrigation, recreation, firm power. In the Northwest, hydro shaped a culture where timing could be managed across a cascade. The lesson utilities took was simple: if you build around water, you tame variability. Nobody priced the risk that timing would shift and head would fall for weeks exactly when cities sweltered. Then markets entered. In the 199s and 200s, independent power producers built efficient combined cycles, often with recirculating cooling to smooth permitting. Withdrawals fell by orders of magnitude, which helped ecosystems and compliance. But consumption rose through evaporation, and the condenser still wanted cool nights and cold sinks. Deregulated markets valued megawatts and capacity credits. River temperature never showed up in the clearing price. A quieter engineering doctrine hardened into gospel. Chase condenser vacuum, chase delta T, chase efficiency. Cold intake water shaved heat rate and fattened margins. Summer peaks overlapped with warm rivers, but nights cooled enough to reset. Design days were drawn from historical weather. The blind spot wasn't denial, it was habit built into spreadsheets and permits. Policy layered on constraints that seemed manageable. Section 316, A and B, under the Clean Water Act tightened thermal discharge and intake impacts. Endangered species law added seasonal flow protections. States wrote stricter criteria during sensitive periods. Operators responded with screens, fish protection, modified outfalls, and when needed, summer derates masked as maintenance. The message was, comply and carry on. Water stayed background because compliance looked like a box you could check. 2 shifts made that background loud. First, heat waves got stickier. Nights stayed hot, especially in humid regions, cutting recovery for towers, condensers, and transformers. Second, drought deepened and timing drifted. Snowmelt arrived earlier in the west. Late summer inflows thinned. River ambient temperatures pushed up across the southeast and midwest. The permits, written against yesterday's baseline, turned into hard ceilings. The places chosen for cold water stopped being reliably cold when it mattered. Meanwhile, transmission mapped around the same geography. Lines grew from those river valleys and coastal corridors, knitting clusters of water-anchored plants into regional grids. That helped until a heat dome spread across the whole cluster. Then every station saw the same warm river within hours, and downstream units inherited upstream deltas like a ladder with missing rungs. The wires were strong, the sink was the weakness. Finance cemented the blind spot's cost. Book values and forward curves assumed summer revenue from plants anchored to rivers. Insurance priced physical risk, not environmental curtailment. Only in the 201s did riders appear for heat-driven derates, and only recently did lenders ask for intake temperature histories and discharge headroom under 316A. By then, citing decisions from the 196s through 199s had locked the fleet where hydrology was changing fastest. So when a control room today stares at an intake thermometer, it's seeing a century of choices surface at once: rail maps, dam eras, nuclear optimism, market reforms, and permits written for milder nights, colliding with warmer water and tighter biology. We didn't ignore water on purpose. We optimized around it, assumed it would behave, and never built an operating culture for when it wouldn't. The blind spot wasn't a missing paragraph. It was the page the whole book was printed on. Heat domes, hot rivers, and forced derates. 3 days into the heat dome, the dashboard still looked calm at noon. Reserve margins held, day ahead cleared, fuel inventories were fine. Then intake temperatures nudged past permit lines at 3 stations on 2 rivers, and the math flipped. Operators started shaving output, 10 megawatts here, 40 there, to keep outlet deltas inside Section 316 limits. By 2:37 p.m., those small trims equaled a missing plant. The stakes weren't numbers. ERs don't wait for cooler water. Data centers had pre-cooled overnight and were watching buffers melt. Seniors in walk-ups leaned on box fans because they'd already rationed AC. The question stalking the afternoon was blunt. When solar slid and compressors refused, would frequency hold while the rivers said no? At 2:41, a combined cycle on a broad, slow river posted a corrective action, derate to 82% until intake drops below 86 degrees. The control room logged it, then pivoted to an intertie that was already hot and wildfire watched. Across the basin, a nuclear unit tightened margin by 5% to keep condenser back pressure below a trip band. Hold just below the alarm, the shift lead said. Do not trip. That wasn't drama. It was the line between a pricey evening and a week-long crisis. By 3:15, the day's real villain showed up. No nighttime reset. Towers had started the morning warm. Transformers hadn't shed heat. With ambient in the hundreds and humidity high, tower approach temperatures flattened across the fleet. Even plants not pinned by permits felt the air bite. The afternoon ramp began from a lower base, then got squeezed by every tenth of a degree climbing in the river. While that was unfolding, the West was counting feet instead of degrees. A desert-adjacent dam ran hard enough to honor contracts, but not so hard it flirted with cavitation. "We can give you the ramp, not the hold," the hydro per lead told the balancing authority. Inflows were lagging, head was thin. The reservoir release schedule had to protect fish, shipping, and minimum elevations. Every extra megawatt in the evening came out of tomorrow's buffer. Back east, operators moved through the playbook. Public appeals went out asking customers to shift laundry and pre-cool homes. Demand response fired, big box stores dimmed, a cement kiln paused, cold storage coasted on last night's chill. Peakers with air cooling spun at punishing cost. Imports were scraped from neighbors until line ratings, already derated for heat, said stop. One cloud bank threatened solar output at the worst hour. Operators watched satellite loops like cardiograms. At 4:02, a river corridor turned into a ladder of constraints. Plant A's legal temperature rise became Plant B's ambient starting point. By the time water reached Plant C downstream, the allowed delta was a sliver. Each unit trimmed 5% to stay legal. The corridor lost an invisible power plant without a single trip, just compliance written into dispatch. Then came the nuclear moment everyone feared and planned for. Years earlier, European rivers had forced reactor curtailments during heat waves. Here, the intake thermometer flirted with a limit that would trigger a conservative shutdown. The shift team took the only path left: deeper derate, accept price spikes, keep safety margins intact, and ride the dome. Reliability bent so the core didn't. The impacts rippled, prices pushed toward scarcity caps. Distribution feeders flagged thermal alarms as neighborhood transformers baked. A data center shifted compute out of state, eating bandwidth and burning more electricity elsewhere. The hospital finished its chiller restart in a tight window the operator carved, pumps staged like choreography. Downriver, the wastewater plant upped chemicals to treat warmer influent as the biologist pinged in dissolved oxygen readings. By 5:12, the feedback loop tightened another notch. Warm nights ahead meant towers wouldn't reset. Warm discharge, within permit, kept reach temperatures high, so tomorrow's intake would start closer to the line. Transformers would carry residual heat. Every hour under the dome loaded the next day's dice against the grid. Out west, a different feedback hammered reliability. Early snowmelt had already moved spring energy into May. By July, hydro shape was wrong for evening ramps. Reservoir operators pulsed releases to cover shoulders, then cut to protect elevations. Contracts that read firm turned into best efforts. Buyers paid at the worst hour. Unknown to traders watching the real-time chart, a fisheries closure expanded downstream to reduce angling stress in overheated reaches. The same map showing thermal units blinking yellow showed aquatic warnings. The grid and the river were having parallel emergencies. By 6:08, the last levers were human. Operators called hospitals and water plants with tight windows. "You're clear for 6 minutes. You're clear for 10. A school district that installed chilled water tanks the previous winter coasted through dismissal without a spike. A low-income housing block enrolled in automated pre-cooling saw settlements drift down at noon and ride the evening without tripping breakers. Each small, dry megawatt mattered more than one more plea to a warm river. Sunset didn't end it. Heat hung in the concrete. The night forecast kept ambient high enough that towers would wake up tired. Operators sketched tomorrow's plan with bigger margins, pre-stage peakers earlier, lock in demand blocks, secure scarce imports before lunch, coordinate a hospital schedule around a cooler hour. The improvisation they used to save a day became a summer protocol. The wind was quiet, no nuclear trips, no broad rolling outages, no mass fish kills tied to a single discharge. The cost was obvious, a grid forced to admit that rivers now write part of the dispatch order. In those hours, the system learned a hard lesson. The meter that mattered wasn't on a generator. It was bolted to a pipe in the river, and it was telling the truth. Western water unravels, hydropower as a failing battery. While the east was counting degrees, the west was counting feet. Hydropower, the quiet battery that steadied the western grid, started acting like a phone that dies at 12% no matter what the icon shows. Operators watched two numbers that decide everything: head, the vertical drop that gives turbines their push, and inflow, the water arriving to replace what they release. When both slip, the promise of firm energy becomes a guess. Stakes first, millions lean on the Colorado River system for water and power. Rural co-ops built budgets around Hoover and Glen Canyon credits. Tribes hold rights intertwined with river flows. Cities count on low-cost hydro to cushion summer bills. When reservoirs fall, the cushion thins. Everything that replaces it costs more, especially at 7 p.m. in August. The same households sweating through heat waves now pay a premium because a river that used to be a sure thing is. Action moved in inches. At Lake Powell, operators track minimum power pool like a cliff edge. Near 3,490 feet, the turbines can't bite. Federal outlooks have spelled it out. By October 2026 under dry scenarios, or by fall 2027 under most probable forecasts, Powell can brush that line. Upstream pulses from Flaming Gorge and other reservoirs can buy time, but only by borrowing from somewhere else in the basin. Downstream, Lake Mead's story rhymes. If Mead slips toward 1,035 feet, Hoover Dam's generating capacity drops roughly 70%. A dozen of 17 units sit quiet. That's not folklore, that's in Bureau of Reclamation projections and tested in unit curves. You can feel it on the grid when a desert city expects a rush of hydro at dusk and gets a trickle. While that was unfolding on the mainstem, timing betrayed the Northwest. Snowmelt that once fed July now peaked weeks earlier. Run-of-river projects, which depend on steady flow rather than big storage, surged in spring and faded just as demand crested under coastal heat pushing inland. By August, the shape was wrong, plenty when ACs idled, thin when they roared. Hydro didn't disappear, it shifted its help to the hours that mattered least. California lived both stories at once. In wet years, reservoirs brim and hydro glides into summer like a miracle. It buries gas burn and softens prices. In dry years, the glide vanishes. A transmission import that used to deliver northern hydro at dinner now arrives half-filled, or not at all. The operator's morning note started carrying a caveat in plain English. Hydrology governs today's evening ramp. No market trick fixes a missing river. Contracts collided with physics. Firm hydro-backed power deals for decades. But when inflow drops and head shrinks, releases are cut to protect infrastructure, ecology, and legal minima. What reads as 7 by 24 turns into best efforts. Buyers scramble for replacement megawatts at the hour of maximum pain, and the price chart spikes. Hydro, built to tame variability, started transmitting it downstream. The human moments told the same truth. A tribal utility counting on federal hydro allocations to hold community bills steady sat before a council and explained why deliveries fell. A small irrigation district that sold a sliver of hydro into the market missed targets and lost revenue it used to subsidize pumps. Houseboats that once bobbed level with docks now dangled below sun-bleached bathtub rings, a daily reminder that elevation is electricity. Operators tried every tool. Intake modifications pushed penstocks deeper to reach colder, denser water. Runner blades were swapped for designs that tolerate lower head. Release schedules were coordinated to shape an evening pulse without starving fish or shipping lanes. Each move helped at the margins, none changed the trajectory. On dispatch calls you heard the new refrain, "We can ramp you, but we can't hold." One detail mattered to the balancing authorities. Hydro's value isn't the annual kilowatt hours. It's the shape, fast starts, crisp ramps, the ability to follow load when everything else is sluggish. Low reservoirs shrink that shape first. The decisive push at sunset turns into a shrug. Storage and gas step in, but storage has duration limits, and gas needs its own cooling. The evening hinges on a resource that can't always hinge. Law made it tighter. Compact obligations and endangered species protections govern releases before markets do. In the Colorado Basin, shortage tiers triggered cuts to lower basin deliveries, while upper basin managers timed upstream pulses to safeguard Glen Canyon's turbines. When a grid operator asked for more hydro to cover a string of hot nights, the answer arrived as a page of elevations and flow criteria. We can move an hour, not a week. Then came the forecasts that changed meetings. 5-year outlooks showed elevated probabilities that Powell would sit below the target 525-foot band for long stretches, with non-trivial odds of brushing minimum power pool in dry sequences. Meade's path showed meaningful chances of hitting 1,035 feet in a bad year, the threshold where Hoover's capacity is slashed. Planners started assigning seasonal capacity values that fell off a cliff in late summer for unshaped hydro. The meaning hardened. Hydropower didn't vanish, it became volatile. It could still save a day, but you couldn't count on it saving the week. Regions rewrote accreditation, downrating late summer hydro and layering storage to catch the lost shape. Prices learned the lesson faster than policy did, and the Western battery's new habit, flickering right when thermal units are derating on warm intakes, made one thing clear. If the battery blinks and the boilers breathe hot air, the only steady thing left is whatever doesn't ask a river for help. The nuclear paradox, reliable until water isn't. Nuclear sells steadiness, months of fuel on site, turbines humming through storms, a gigawatt that doesn't blink when clouds roll in. But the promise rides on a quiet dependency, a cold sink that keeps the steam cycle inside narrow thermal and safety margins. When that sink warms or thins, reliability becomes restraint. Stakes first. A single inland reactor can carry the evening margin for a metro, hospitals, subways, data centers, whole neighborhoods leaning on one unit. If intake temperatures creep toward permit caps or flows dip below ecological thresholds, operators face a choice that isn't really a choice: feather output or risk a protection trip that takes hours, sometimes days, to unwind. A conservative derate can prevent a week-long crisis or trigger a price spike that lands in every apartment's bill. The people who feel it never see the intake thermometer that forced the call. Action unfolds in tenths of a degree. Inland plants live by river behavior. Permits under the Clean Water Act set 2 levers: a maximum outlet temperature and a cap on how much warmer the discharge can be than the river. During a heat dome, ambient water arrives near those ceilings. The allowed delta collapses to slivers. Ops teams watch condenser back pressure inch up. They clean tubes, tweak circulating pumps, squeeze vacuum, then pull megawatts, 5%, sometimes 10%, to stay under both the legal line and the safety band that trips alarms. On the log, it reads like paperwork. In the control room, it's the difference between a hospital's chillers and a forced shutdown. Coastal units face a different wall. The ocean's flow looks limitless until marine heat waves lift intake temperatures and seasonal blooms clog screens with gelatinous life. Diablo Canyon and its piers ride anomalies that test comfort margins while marine protections tighten discharge criteria. Storm surge and swell add caution. Flow isn't scarce, cold is. The paradox holds: the reactor is steady, the sink is not. Technology turns the screw. Nuclear plants run at modest thermal efficiency compared to the best gas units, so they must reject more waste heat per megawatt. Hot nights shrink the condenser's temperature drop, raising back pressure on the turbine. Output falls exactly when the grid wants the gigawatt. Engineers can chase incremental gains, biocide cycles to keep tubes clean, optimized pump curves, polished vacuum systems, but they can't turn an 86-degree river into 74. The law makes physics binding. Section 316A limits thermal plumes to protect dissolved oxygen and habitat. 316B controls intake design to reduce fish impingement and entrainment. Finer screens and lower intake velocities save biology, but add hydraulic losses that nibble at condenser performance on the hottest days. Endangered species rules set minimum flows that can trump withdrawal plans. The plant's firmness becomes a negotiation with ecology, overseen by permits, with enforcement and courts in the background. When heat arrives, compliance isn't a checkbox, it's the lever that tugs a city's evening. Operates expose the margin. Many reactors planned small power bumps to eke more megawatts from the same core. On paper, clean capacity. On the river, more heat to shed into the same sink. As summers warm, the headroom that made operates feasible shrinks. Some projects stall not because the reactor can't handle it, but because the condenser and water body can't. The bottleneck isn't nuclear physics, it's thermodynamics meeting ecology at 5 p.m. Operators developed choreography after watching European rivers force curtailments. Start the morning assertive, then feather back before intake temps hit trip bands. Coordinate with the grid so demand response and air-cooled peakers cover the evening dip. Stage maintenance on the hottest weeks to mask unavoidable derates as planned. Put environmental monitors on open lines to adjust discharge within safe envelopes. It's not heroics, it's muscle memory for warm water. Finance priced the paradox. A gigawatt that vanishes at the margin loses revenue when scarcity premiums peak. Seasonal accreditation trims paper capacity unless plants can prove performance under heat. Hybrid cooling, wastewater tie-ins, documented condenser approach on hot nights. Insurers add riders for environmental curtailments. Lenders ask for intake temperature histories, discharge headroom, and basin drought outlooks. Inland sites with once-through cooling draw higher risk spreads. Hybrid or dry assist designs earn credit even with efficiency penalties. Can cooling be fixed? Dry and hybrid systems exist, but they're not free. Towers and air coolers cost capital, make noise, and shave efficiency hardest when air is hottest. Retrofitting a large legacy unit is a multi-year project. Wastewater reuse helps. Purple pipe municipal effluent feeding the circulating loop shifts stress off rivers, but needs treatment upgrades, pipelines, and politics. None of it is quick, and the heat arrives every summer. The human scene anchors it. A shift lead draws a narrow band on a whiteboard, safe condenser pressure here, trip there. The grid operator calls, "I need your full nameplate at 6. The environmental monitor radios from a mile downstream, "Dissolved oxygen is tight, stay under your delta." The lead looks at the intake readout climbing by tenths and answers both. "We'll hold just below the alarm." Reliability becomes restraint by design. Advanced designs try to dodge the trap. Small modular reactors promise lower absolute discharges, easier siting, and pairing with hybrid or dry cooling from day one. Some pitch co-location with wastewater plants, embedding the purple pipe in the business case. Others tout inland sites with colder aquifers or larger bodies that warm less. The idea isn't magic. It's starting with the sink instead of ending with it. You pay in efficiency and capital. You get megawatts that don't bargain with a river at dusk. Here's the paradox in one line. Nuclear is the steady bridge through long nights until water warms, flows thin, and the cold sink that makes the promise real starts to slip. The machine didn't change. The water did. And that means permits, law, and money now sit in the dispatch stack right next to physics. Law, permits, and the temperature trap. The next constraint isn't metal or fuel. It's a line in a permit that turns a warm afternoon into a hard ceiling. Under the Clean Water Act, Section 316A governs thermal discharges, 316B governs intake structures. Those numbers sound bureaucratic until a control room hits them at 4 p.m. and a city learns that biology, not gas supply, will decide the evening. Stakes first. That permit is the legal fence between megawatts and a living river. Cross a thermal limit and you risk fish kills, enforcement, lawsuits, and forced retrofits. For a hospital waiting to restart chillers, for a neighborhood stacked with window units, the paperwork becomes a throttle. Operators don't get to bargain with it, they plan around it. Here's how the trap tightens in heat. Thermal permits assume an ambient water temperature and allow only a small rise above it at the discharge, plus an absolute cap on outlet temperature. When a heat dome drags the river's starting point near that cap, the allowable delta collapses from degrees to tenths. A 1-degree rise on paper becomes 0.2 in practice. Plants trim output before they exceed it because the penalty for crossing isn't just a fine. It's a loss of trust and a risk of shutdowns that ripple for days. Intakes face their own law. 316B demands best technology available to protect fish and larvae, wedge wire screens, reduced intake velocities, modified structures. They work, but they add hydraulic losses that raise circulating pump load and nudge condenser performance the wrong way when air is already brutal. The fix for biology eats margin on the hottest days. No one designed it as a conflict. It's just where habitat protection meets thermodynamics. Then endangered species law and state criteria step in. Minimum ecological flows can override withdrawal plans. Several states layer tighter thermal rules during spawning or low flow periods, smaller allowed rises, lower seasonal caps. In drought years, that takes prudent derates and turns them into mandatory. A river corridor can go from legal cushion to legal thread in 24 hours. Operators try to earn flexibility. Some seek temporary variances for extreme heat, offering tighter monitoring, shorter durations, and downstream temperature checks. Regulators rarely say yes. Communities remember past kills, biologists bring dissolved oxygen charts, tribes lean on treaty rights, anglers show up with photos. An agency might grant a narrow window under strict conditions, but the default is to hold the line. The river doesn't get a do-over. So retrofit right. Cooling towers can convert once through to closed cycle, slashing withdrawals and easing 316B exposure. But towers add capital, noise, plume, and a new ledger, evaporative consumption that bites in basins already rationing. Hybrid or dry assist systems cut consumption, but hit efficiency hardest in hot air, exactly when you need output. Retrofitting a big unit is a multi-year project with new air permits, visual impacts, neighbors, and interlocks. It's a path, not a patch. Wastewater reuse is the quiet workaround. Tie a plant circulating loop to municipal effluent, and you shift stress off a river during heat alerts. It works if the city can spare flow in August, if treatment upgrades deliver the quality needed, if pipelines clear easements, if interagency politics align. In fast-growing metros, reuse has its own summer peak. A utility that signs early locks resilience. One that waits ends up in a bidding war with new customers and drought rules. Litigation stretches timelines. Environmental groups challenge variances. Utilities appeal permit terms. States and tribes assert water rights that reorder who dips a pipe first. Each filing pushes upgrades and derates into another season. Lenders watch and widen spreads. Insurers add business interruption riders for environmental curtailments. The cost of uncertainty shows up before a single bolt is turned. Markets are catching up. Accreditation used to treat a megawatt as a megawatt. Now summer capacity credits shrink for plants on warm rivers unless they harden. Hybrid cooling proven under heat. Signed purple pipe contracts. Demonstrated condenser approach on hot nights. A combined cycle that can show logs of performance at 86-degree intake earns. A once-through unit with stacked downstream neighbors gets discounted. The signal is simple: get legal, get dry, or get less credit. One scene explains the trap. A shift lead stares at a discharge thermometer brushing the cap, while a downstream biologist radios dissolved oxygen numbers. The grid operator asks for 10 more megawatts. The permit says trim 5. He trims. Frequency wobbles, prices jump, fish live, and the plant stays out of court. That's not caution, that's the system doing what the law designed it to do. Adaptive permitting can make this sane without gutting protections. Pre-qualify heat protocols in spring, verified hybrid cooling performance curves, wastewater reserves, automatic derate triggers at defined river temps, continuous monitoring with public feeds, and downstream coordination among stacked plants. In return, regulators allow minute-by-minute adjustments within a safe envelope. No last-minute pleadings, no Friday variances. Biology stays the line. Operations get predictability. Finance will enforce the rest. Require hydrology readiness, disclosures in dockets, 5-year intake temperature trends, discharge headroom, retrofit plans, and alternate sources. Publish them. Insurers and lenders will move spreads accordingly. Projects that treat water as a first-class constraint will clear. Those that hope for cooler rivers will sit. The trap doesn't disappear. It becomes a plan instead of a surprise. The $50 trillion number, where it comes from. We've been talking in gauges, degrees, and feet. Here's the bill that falls out when those numbers drive planning. That $50 trillion tag isn't a scare line. It's the multi-decade price of building a grid that doesn't beg a warm river for mercy at 6 p.m. Start with replacement value for summer firmness. Every thermal megawatt that evaporates under heat has to be replaced not one for one, but with portfolios that show up when water doesn't. That means sprawling, water-light generation, solar across latitudes, wind across regimes, plus storage that shifts noon into night and holds through multi-day heat domes. 4-hour batteries shave peaks. 8 to 12-hour systems bridge the ramps. Long duration fills the dead calm. You don't buy one plant, you buy an orchestra sized for August. Over 20 years, that stack runs into the trillions before you string a single mile of wire. Wires are the multiplier. Geography turns from trap to asset only if steel connects deserts, plains, coasts, and valleys. High-voltage DC backbones to move big blocks across time zones. Reinforced AC corridors that don't sag into constraints under heat. Right-of-way, permitting materials, labor, each mile is a project, and you need thousands. Put a price on a national lattice that can carry dry electrons to wet bottlenecks on queue, and you've added several trillion more. Delay costs double here. Every year you don't build becomes 5 summers of scarcity pricing downstream. Cooling retrofits land on a parallel ledger. Some legacy plants can survive with hybrid or dry assist, and with purple pipe wastewater feeding their loops. Towers and air coolers cost 9 or 10 figures per site and shave efficiency when air bakes. Wastewater tie-ins mean treatment upgrades, easements, and politics. Dozens of large units multiplied by real retrofit costs becomes another trillion-scale bucket if you only count what makes sense to keep. You'll still retire a chunk that can't pass physics, permits, and finance at once. Those retirements leave stranded value on balance sheets. Stranded assets hide the next line item. Once through plants on warming rivers, hydro contracts written on old hydrographs, uprates that hit condenser walls, write-downs and early closures push losses through rate cases or investor books. Add insurance premiums for environmental curtailments and business interruption, then add higher debt costs where risk disclosures admit heat-driven derates. 2 percentage points of finance spread on billions over decades quietly turns into hundreds of billions. The cost of uncertainty is real money. Demand-side capital is the cheapest dry megawatt and still isn't free. Thermal storage in buildings, chilled water tanks in schools, hospitals, campuses, pre-cools nights and sales through 4 p.m. retrofits for envelopes and controls in the hottest, poorest neighborhoods avoid the exact spikes that trip feeders. Industrial load flexibility, kilns shifted, batch processes moved, cold storage pre-chilled, turns factories into dispatchable assets. Cities digitize water plants and wastewater ops to ride alerts. Roll those programs across metros and states, and you're spending serious money, less than peakers, far less than blackouts, but still measured in the hundreds of billions. Then there's siting and the premium for speed. Build where water risk is low and transmission is planned and capital flows. Build cheap in a drought corridor and you pay every August forever. The difference shows up as a lifetime tariff delta that ratepayers feel for decades. Accelerating everything, wires, storage, portfolios, carries its own premium. Overtime labor, parallel permitting teams, early-stage risk capital. Speed costs, delay costs more. Hydrology-proofing data centers is its own column. Air side systems that auto-switch on heat alerts. Thermal storage big enough to coast through the evening ramp. Contractual demand response that behaves like generation, wastewater hookups instead of fresh withdrawals. Multiply that by the campuses already in the queue, and you add tens of billions just to make the digital load rider water away a grid without diesel. Water supply projects that free the grid from rivers sit in the background. Purple pipe networks, advanced treatment at reuse plants, and regional exchanges that route effluent to cooling and return potable to taps. All of it is civil works at city scale. These investments improve resilience beyond energy, public health, growth capacity, drought buffers, but they're part of the energy bill because they decide whether a hospital's AC leans on a river or a pipe. Policy turns dials and still can't erase physics. Credits for clean generation, storage, and transmission shave capital. Standards that force seasonal capacity accreditation steer portfolios toward dry reliability. Grants for building upgrades bring forward demand flexibility, but none of those replace the miles, the steel, the batteries, the towers, the tanks. They move cost from rates to taxes. They don't make the bill vanish. So how does this stack to $50 trillion? Add a decade of generation and storage builds scaled for August, plus a continent's worth of high-capacity wires. Layer cooling retrofits where they pass the math, retire what can't, write down stranded value, and pay the finance premium for risk. Fund demand-side hardware at city scale. Build water reuse where legacy plants must stay. Then carry those dollars through interest over 20 to 30 years while load rises from electrification and AI. You don't write one check. You build an asset base the size of the old grid, but tuned for heat and water. There's one last column we usually ignore: the price of doing nothing. That ledger shows emergency diesel, medical bills from heat stress, crop losses, fisheries crashes, litigation, outage damages, and a decade of summer price spikes, money burned with nothing built. Compare that to a grid that keeps ORs cold, servers online without diesel, trout alive, and bills sane in August. One path leaves receipts. The other leaves infrastructure that doesn't argue with a river. The number is large either way. Only one buys out of the trap. Map of risk, the hidden choke points of American power. Lay generation over hydrology, and a different grid appears, drawn by temperature lines, reservoir elevations, and stacked permits. The choke points aren't substations, they're watersheds where cold is scarce exactly when people need it. Start in the southwest, where the Colorado River is both backbone and liability. Phoenix and Las Vegas sit on load islands that lean on Hoover and Glen Canyon for shape, not just energy. If Lake Mead drops near 1,035 feet, Hoover's effective capacity gets slashed, roughly 70% gone as a dozen turbines go quiet. If Lake Powell brushes minimum power pool near 3,490 feet, Glen Canyon turns cautious. Gas plants ring the metros, but many lean on reservoirs and recycled water with summer constraints. On the worst evenings, hydro arrives thin, thermals derate on warm intakes, and scarcity pricing climbs like the temperature. Geography writes the schedule: long heat, thin head, and load that refuses to sleep. Slide into Texas, where ERCOT's confidence meets lakes and relentless heat. Gas, wind, and solar share the stage. But still, hot evenings dull wind, sunset drops solar, and reservoir-cooled units feel intake temperatures creep. A few feet down on a droughted lake, a few degrees up in August air, and combined cycles trim just when the system needs them steady. Add humidity that blunts tower performance, and the hinge is clear. Thermal units become the last guardrail, narrowed by water. Cities from Dallas to Austin ride peakers and price spikes that say as much about lakes as about fuel. Head north to the Ohio, Tennessee belt, a quiet dependency most maps miss. Dozens of gas combined cycles and legacy units line warm, slow rivers. Permits cap both outlet temperature and the rise above ambient. Upstream plants use their legal delta. Downstream plants inherit that ambient as their starting point. In a heat wave, the ladder compresses. Each unit trims 5% to stay legal. Stacked across a corridor, you lose a virtual power plant with no alarms, just compliance. Humid nights kill recovery, towers start warm, and the next day's headroom shrinks before breakfast. Drop into the southeast, where broad rivers once looked infinite. Heat domes say otherwise. Once through stations hit intake temperature caps, recirculating units see towers stall when nights stay hot and wet. State criteria tighten during spawning windows, endangered species flows set hard minimums. Nuclear anchors can't ignore any of it. A cautious 5% derate at one plant becomes a flurry of calls. Demand response, hospital coordination, imports over interfaces already sagging in heat. Equity shows up in the map. Neighborhoods with weak envelopes and high bills feel every degree of constraint. Now swing to the Pacific Northwest. Hydropower still dominates identity, but timing is the villain. Snowmelt that once fed July shifts into spring. Run-of-river projects fade when coastal heat drives inland demand. Reservoirs protect fish and shipping lanes before feeding turbines. Thermal units along the Columbia meet the same thermal criteria on hot weeks. Imports from California flip direction precisely when both regions bake. What used to be a rescue becomes two neighbors tapping the same shallow pool. California sits on the knife edge. In wet years, hydro fills the shoulders and cools prices. In dry years, it withdraws and leaves gas and storage to carry the ramp. Coastal plants gain flow resilience, but meet marine heat waves, clogged screens, and tight discharge rules. Inland units pair with wastewater, but effluent has its own seasonality. The choke point is a calendar. Late summer weeks when hydro wilts, solar wanes at dinner, and batteries must be deep enough to bridge without leaning on hot rivers or overworked gas. Add load growth, and the map brightens in all the wrong places. The Sunbelt's demand swells exactly where hydrology tightens. Phoenix, Las Vegas, Dallas, Austin, Atlanta, each adding data centers and electrification to corridors already governed by warm water. Non-coincident peaks start to synchronize when everyone bakes at once. The result is stacked stress. Multiple metros tug on rivers that can't donate cooling capacity at the same hour. There's a quieter choke point, permit stacking. A legal 1-degree rise for plant A becomes ambient for plant B by plant C. The allowed rise is a sliver. Coordination helps, but physics stacks the deck. A corridor can lose tens or hundreds of megawatts in invisible slices, then hit transmission interfaces that are derated for heat or risked by wildfire smoke. If the rescue line is constrained, a warm intake in Kentucky becomes a price spike in the Carolinas. Overlay drought projections and intake temperature trends, and 5 clusters glow. The Colorado Basin's desert load islands, ERCOT's lake-tethered thermals amid fast growth, the Ohio-Tennessee corridor with dense shaded river exposure, the Southeast's humid nuclear-anchored stretches, and the Northwest's late summer hydro thinness. Each is a different physics story with the same ending. When the sink runs hot, the grid runs short. The fix starts with acknowledging the map. Harden what you must. Hybrid cooling and purple pipe contracts in moderate-risk corridors. Replace what you can't. Water-light portfolios stitched by big wires where heat and hydrology align against you. And plan dispatch around permits and river temps like they're fuel curves, because in these choke points, they are. The data center rush versus water reality. The first calls sounded harmless, site selectors asking if a substation could spare a few hundred megawatts and whether the city had adequate water. A year later, the questions arrived as binding letters of intent: 200 to 500 megawatts per campus, 24/7, construction in 18 months, with cooling plans that turned adequate into a word nobody could define the same way twice. Stakes first, AI shifted the curve from steady growth to stampede. Counties that hadn't permitted a factory in a decade were suddenly entertaining 4 hyperscale proposals in a month. Jobs and tax revenue glowed on the pitch deck, but the real impact lived downstream. Loads that never sleep, cooling that either drinks water or gulps electricity, and timing that overlaps perfectly with the hours when rivers run hot and the grid begs for slack. Action felt like a tug-of-war between physics and ambition. In a humid southern metro already pressed by summer peaks, a developer pitched a 300-megawatt campus with evaporative cooling tuned for world-class efficiency. The water department laid the daily demand curve next to river temperature trends and saw the problem immediately. Peak day withdrawals would rival a mid-sized town, precisely when intake temps pushed the upstream gas plant to derate. "We can serve it," the director said, "but not in August without upgrades." Upgrades meant new mains, bigger pumps, added treatment, and a fight over who pays. Across the state line, another team led with air-side cooling, less water, more electricity. The grid operator liked the water story and then asked the only question that mattered: where do your extra megawatts come from at 7 p.m. during a heat alert? The developer offered on-site batteries and a firming contract. The operator nodded and pointed at the gap. A 2-hour battery doesn't carry a 10-hour heat dome. Meanwhile, site selectors circulated a memo. Dual-source cooling is now table stakes. Lenders and insurers began writing conditions into term sheets: automatic switchover from evaporative to air only on heat alerts, thermal storage sized to coast through evening ramps, and contracts for demand response that behave like generation. Adequate water was no longer a headcount in a pipe. It was legal, physical, seasonal, and priced. Communities pushed back where drought lived in memory. In a desert county, residents who had watched lawns go brown listened to renderings of misted towers and asked a blunt question: why should servers get water their park's car? The developer pivoted to wastewater reuse. The city engineer traced a purple pipe route on a map and listed the catches: treatment upgrades, easements across neighborhoods, summer seasonality of effluent, and competing industrial users. Reuse beats fresh withdrawals if you build it years before the racks arrive. Timelines collided in real time. Data center schedules move in quarters, transmission lines, wastewater plants, and new portfolios move in years. A utility planner told a county board the sentence that changes votes: your campus will be ready before the wires and water that make it reliable. The developer put cash on the table for a substation and storage. The planner pointed at the calendar. The battery helps at 5. Our problem is 8. Then came the day the abstraction turned into diesel. A regional cloud operator hit a water alert block. Ambient intake temperatures were pushing a nearby plant to trim. Imports were constrained by hot lines, and the balancing authority called large loads for cuts. Large hyperscale data centers consume 515 million gallons per day when on evaporative systems. On heat alerts, that water demand collides with tighter permits. The ops lead tried to ride on thermal storage and throttled workloads to another state, eating latency and bandwidth. It bought 20 minutes. He turned the key on generators he swore would only run in storms and typed the log everyone else ignores. Start due to grid constrained by intake temp. Utilities started drawing a cleaner line. Tariffs put teeth behind dry reliability. Campuses that committed to air-side cooling on heat alerts built big chilled water tanks and enrolled in fast demand response got better rates. Those that wouldn't had to fund upgrades and accept curtailment risk. Some developers adapted, adding football field-sized tanks, tuned controls that pre-cooled at night, and software that shed non-critical loads at 4 p.m. Others looked for a friendlier county. One detail kept showing up in operator briefings: non-coincident peaks were disappearing. Training runs soaked nights. Inference rode the day. Cooling never slept. Cluster 3 campuses on the same warm river corridor, and their flat, relentless demand turned most days into every day. Without new water light supply and big wires, the cluster became a reliability risk with glossy renderings. A council hearing captured the new rules. The developer offered taxes, STEM grants, and pretty facades. A nurse asked how the campus would behave on a heat alert day. The answer that won the vote was simple and contractual: air-side on alerts, thermal storage for 4 hours, demand response enrollment, purple pipe reuse by year 2, and a penalty if a diesel started outside a test. The county wrote those promises into the permit. The grid operator exhaled. The river got a break. And the campus learned what adequate means when cold is scarce. The false savior: hydrogen, CCS, and water burdens. Here's the promise that keeps showing up at hearings: don't scrap the fleet, swap the fuel or bolt on capture. Hydrogen-ready turbines, carbon scrubbers on stacks, firm, low-carbon power that keeps the evening solid. On a whiteboard, it's neat. In August, next to a warm river and a permit cap, the math turns messy because both fixes lean harder on water. Stakes first: communities want jobs to stay, politicians want carbon to fall. Grid operators want megawatts that actually show up at 7 p.m. under a heat alert. Hydrogen and CCS claim all three, but firm power that drinks more or rejects more heat into a sink that's already failing at dusk isn't firm where it matters. If the cold source is the constraint, the fix can't ask that source for more. Start with hydrogen. Green hydrogen means electrolysis, which turns water and electricity into hydrogen and oxygen. The headline is clean fuel. The footnote is water. Roughly 9 kilograms of ultra-pure water per kilogram of hydrogen, plus losses for purification and cooling. Scale to a large turbine, and you're talking the daily water of a town block. Blue hydrogen leans on natural gas with carbon capture, and still needs cooling at the plant and water upstream in processing. Either way, the molecule that promises freedom from carbon arrives with a steady water bill. Then the machine: burn hydrogen in a modified combined cycle, and you inherit faster flames, tougher NOx control, and hotter exhaust. Hotter exhaust means more heat to reject. The condenser doesn't care that the fuel is green, it still wants a cold sink. On hot afternoons, hybrid or dry assist cooling can trim withdrawals, but they pay with efficiency penalties exactly when the grid is begging for output. A plant that looks decarbonized and firm in January looks like its old self in July, feathering at 4 p.m. to honor the same thermal limits. Now CCS. Amine systems wash CO2 from flue gas, then regenerate solvent with steam. That steam isn't free, it's siphoned from the plant and must be cooled like everything else. The net effect is more auxiliary load and more waste heat to dump per megawatt delivered. Field data and studies point to double-digit increases in water consumption per kilowatt hour, sometimes on the order of half again, depending on design. In basins where 316A thermal caps and 316B intake limits already bind, that isn't a rounding error. It's a curtailment pushed into the evening. Permits make the conflict explicit. A CCS unit still faces outlet temperature caps and allowed rises above ambient. If ambient water arrives near those caps, the delta shrinks to tenths. Asking for a thermal variance because we're capturing carbon runs straight into dissolved oxygen curves and fish stress readings. Hydrogen turbines meet law from a different angle: water rights and seasonality. Electrolyzers sited inland may promise wastewater reuse, but effluent peaks on its own clock, often not when noon solar makes power cheap. Coastal desal cuts freshwater demand, but adds pretreatment energy and brine disposal politics. Finance notices quickly. Risk memos now ask 3 blunt questions before a hydrogen or CCS retrofit gets money. Whose water, which months, under which permits? If the answer is the same river that forces derates on hot days, spreads widen. Insurers write riders for environmental curtailment and business interruption tied to heat. Seasonal capacity accreditation trims summer value unless the project can prove performance at 86-degree intake with logs, not slides. A hydrogen-ready, combined cycle without dry assist or a purple pipe contract looks like capacity that vanishes right when scarcity prices peak. There are places the story can work. Pair coastal electrolyzers with offshore wind, desal designed for brine management, and turbines sited where marine heat isn't the cap. Tie a CCS retro to plant with access to cold seawater and permissive diffusion. Feed thermal loops with municipal effluent where the city has surplus and the pipe run is short. Season operations, pull back on heat alerts, run harder on mild nights. Those are niche fits with honest calendars. They're not a blanket answer for river corridors already stacked with plants ratcheting down to keep trout alive. Meanwhile, incentives muddy the water. Credits make blue hydrogen and CCS look cheap, but credits don't cool rivers. A retrofitted plant still hits the same intake thermometer. A hydrogen turbine still needs water for its fuel and its condenser. Policy can bend a spreadsheet, it can't shift the evening's ambient by 10 degrees. Markets are starting to reflect that. Summer accreditation pays for what shows up at dusk without begging a river. So the test is simple. If your decarbonization plan adds gallons per megawatt hour or pushes more heat toward a warm sink, it doesn't solve August, it rearranges it. The portfolios that hold in heat domes are water light by design, wind and solar spread wide, storage deep enough to bridge, transmission that connects different weather, buildings that act like batteries, and where thermal remains, cooling built for drought, hybrid, dry assist, or wastewater fed, proven under heat. The fix isn't romantic. It's choosing molecules and machines that don't argue with a river at 5 p.m. And if you still want hydrogen in the stack, use it where water isn't the ceiling, industry, storage, coastal peakers with sea as sink, not as a promise that turns to steam when the intake gauge climbs. Waterlight solutions that can scale. Start with the resources that barely touch a river. Wind and solar aren't just cheap, they're dry. A ridgetop turbine doesn't ask a watershed for permission at dusk. A solar array sheds heat to air, not a condenser. On the worst August evening, neither trips a permit. The catch has always been shape, noon glut, sunset gap. So we widen the map and teach time to bend. Distribution is the first multiplier. Put all the solar in one county and you'll drown at noon and beg at dinner. Spread it across latitudes and tie it with steel. Clouds over Phoenix don't mean clouds over West Texas. Gulf breezes often build when inland air stalls. Plains wind peaks at night when coastal heat lingers. Interregional wires turn weather diversity into power you can count on when the river is warm. A DC spine moving desert sun east at dusk can let a southern city keep its towers quiet and its reactors cautious. No bargaining with intake thermometers. Storage makes the scatter into structure. 4-hour batteries shave the ramp. 8-hour blocks carry dinner. Long duration starts to eat a heat dome night after night without a drop of water. This isn't theoretical. In the summer of 2024, California crossed multiple peak days with batteries covering more than 20% of the evening ramp while hydro sat thin. A school district added chilled water tanks, pre-cooled at 3 a.m., and coasted through dismissal without touching the peak. Those tanks don't show up on generation charts. They show up in neighborhoods that stop tripping feeders. Geothermal belongs because it's steady and done right, waterlight. Closed-loop designs circulate a working fluid underground without touching aquifers. Advanced concepts aiming for superhot rock promise dense heat near cities. The pitch isn't romance. It's a plant that doesn't call the river at 5 p.m. and ask for cold. Where geology fits, one unit anchors a metro's margin with no intake drama. Nuclear can fit this future if cooling is chosen first, not last. Hybrid or dry-assisted designs trade a bit of efficiency for gallons saved. Pair a new unit with a wastewater pipeline baked into the pro forma, not stapled on after hearings, and the sink moves from river to purple pipe. Inland, that's the difference between a cautious derate and a steady evening. Yes, you pay more and accept a heat penalty. You also stop negotiating with a permit in August. Transmission is the lever that makes all of it bigger than its parts. High-voltage DC backbones move big blocks with low losses, turning 2 p.m. solar in one time zone into 7 p.m. supply in another. Reinforced AC ties let neighbors share when a heat dome doesn't quite line up. The purpose isn't cheap energy, it's dry energy at the right hour. A spine from the plains into the southeast reduces water-constrained hours more than any single retrofit. That metric, hours when hydrology binds, should decide which lines get built first. Wastewater reuse is the practical fix for legacy plants you can't retire yet. A gas-combined cycle-tapping municipal effluent instead of a hot river relaxes 316 B intakes and keeps 316 A deltas inside limits on heat alerts. One metro signed a deal: summer effluent to the plant's towers, winter flow to industry. It funded treatment, upgrades the city needed anyway, cooled politics, and pulled the plant off the river's throat on the worst days. That's water policy as grid policy. Demand is a resource when you treat buildings like batteries. Smart tariffs nudge pre-cooling at noon and ease off at dusk. Industrial partners shift batch loads and get paid like peakers. Data centers commit to airside cooling on heat alerts and discharge thermal storage as if it were generation. Hospitals sequence chillers into cooler windows planned days in advance. Each tiny move is a dry megawatt. Together, they're the difference between trim 5% to stay legal, and we've got this without touching the river. Markets have to reward the right thing. Seasonal capacity accreditation should pay more for portfolios that show up under heat without water. Solar plus storage at dusk. Wind delivered across a DC tie. Batteries with firm discharge blocks. Thermal hardened with hybrid cooling and purple pipe. A gas plant with signed wastewater and proven performance at 86-degree intake is worth more than a once-through unit upstream of a neighbor who inherits its heat. Examples already exist. The CIZ transmission from West Texas, tied through upgraded interfaces, kept a southeastern city flat through a week-long dome while its river corridor stacked derates. California paired a nuclear hybrid cooling retrofit with new storage and avoided the uprate that would have pushed its sink beyond comfort in heat. Austin Energy layered midday solar, evening batteries, and pre-cooling credits and sailed past a summer that used to mean rolling cuts. None of these stories bragged, they just worked. The recipe is plain and expensive. Build dry generation across geography, build wires that move it to the hour that hurts, build storage that stretches noon to night, retrofit the buildings that spike at 6 p.m., and shift legacy plant sinks from rivers to reuse where they must remain. Do that, and the intake thermometer still matters, but it stops deciding whether an OR restarts or a diesel coughs to life behind a data hall. Who loses, who wins, politics, permits, and local battles. The politics start where the river meets the payroll. A county on the Ohio watches a coal unit announce retirement. The treasurer sees the hole in the school budget before the last shift ends. The union rep points at the substation and says, "Keep the jobs here, replace on site." Across town, a wind developer has an interconnection at a ridge, but the township hall is full of neighbors worried about setbacks and views. The utility sits quietly, running a spreadsheet that asks which fight lands steel in the ground before the next heat dome. Stakes aren't abstract. A riverfront plant has paid for Little League uniforms for decades. The county wants that tax line to live, but the river is now a throttle and permits don't bend for nostalgia. The compromise that actually works is messy. Reuse the node. Drop a solar field on the ash basin, add battery rows inside the fence, install a dry-cooled flexible unit or synchronous condenser in the old turbine hall, and layer are just transition fund that pays for retraining. Not a slogan, contracts, bid dates, and a community college program with start times. Water rights put teeth into every meeting. In the Colorado Basin, a utility proposes a purple pipeline to feed a gas plant's towers with municipal effluent. 3 jurisdictions, 2 tribes, and a reclamation district have claims. Each asks who gets water first when a heat alert lands. The utility offers rates, upgrades, and a drought trigger. A tribal council holds up treaty language and asks why their river should prop up a plant when their neighborhoods ride rolling cuts. The deal only moves when the pipeline contract ties service to community benefits, household cooling centers, electrified clinics, and firm commitments to cut river withdrawals on heat alerts. Permitting reform sounds like a press release until August arrives. Governors pitch faster timelines for both wires and wind. Environmental groups worry that faster means sloppier, especially in habitats already stressed by heat. Grid operators argue that delay is its own harm when hospitals and data centers sit on overheated corridors. A workable bargain shows up in bill text: speed in exchange for water resilience safeguards. Projects near stressed basins must submit seasonal water plans, drought triggers, and binding demand reduction partnerships. The carrot is predictability. The stick is a permit that shuts down if the plan turns out to be marketing. Equity isn't a footnote, it's the map of who bakes when price spikes land. The hottest, poorest blocks sit under the old peakers and beside substations. Advocates arrive with outage histories, AC saturation data, and asthma rates. They ask for the first storage projects to land where feeders trip, for building envelope retrofits alongside rate reform, for medical baselines that keep bills survivable. Utilities that listen start valuing avoided outages and avoided ER visits next to cents per kilowatt-hour. Citing shifts: a battery yard behind a public housing complex, a chilled water tank at a hospital, and a tariff that pre-cools apartments automatically on heat alerts. Data center hearings become master classes in new rules. A developer offers taxes and STEM grants. A nurse asks how the campus behaves on a water alert. The answer that wins votes is contractual, SI'd on alerts, thermal storage sized for 4 hours, purple pipe reuse by year 2, and penalties for diesel starts outside tests. The county bakes those into the permit. The operator wires them into dispatch. The campus gets built because it's a resource on the worst days, not a passenger. Courts shape the field. A Western judge rules minimum flows outrank a plant's evening ramp. The plant fast-tracks a wastewater tie-in, rates move up, the river cools down. In the southeast, compact disputes force utilities to coordinate withdrawals across state lines during heat emergencies. Dispatch meetings now include water agencies. It feels bureaucratic until a week arrives when that phone call keeps both fish alive and clinics cold. Winners aren't technologies, they're places that align incentives with hydrology. Counties that pre-zone wind and storage corridors, sign wastewater agreements early, and offer tariff carrots for flexible demand watch capital show up. Towns that fight every mast and mile of wire watch investors skip to neighbors and plants retire without replacements. The rule is simple: price water risk into permits and markets, and money follows the driest, dependable megawatt. One last scene: a river town loses a coal stack, gains a battery yard, a solar carpet on the ash field, and a training center next to the switch yard. The first hot summer after, the control room rides storage at dusk, the hospital coasts on its chilled water tank, the river runs cooler at night, and nobody calls for a variance. Politics didn't vanish. It picked a side: megawatts that don't beg a warm river for mercy at 6 p.m. The new operating system: planning for variable water. We've been firefighting day by day, shaving megawatts, staging chillers, praying for cooler nights. That only works until hot air, warm water, and hungry load line up for a week. The fix isn't one more plant or one more pipeline. It's a new operating system that treats water like fuel: variable, priced, forecast, and shared. Start with what the market pays for. Capacity accreditation can't pretend a megawatt in April equals a megawatt in August. It doesn't. Seasonal, even monthly, credits have to reflect hydrology. A combined cycle on a warm river might get 95% in spring, 70% in late summer, unless it proves hybrid cooling performance at high intake temps or has a signed purple pipe contract with the city. Run-of-river hydro earns more in May, less in September. Solar paired with batteries that guarantee 4 hours at dusk gets the premium during heat season. The rule is simple: pay for what shows up when the river doesn't. Planning has to shift from averages to scenarios. Resource adequacy models need river flow forecasts, intake temperature trends, and permit constraints the same way they ingest wind shapes and forced outage rates. Hot water weeks aren't stress tests, they're baseline cases. Nighttime air stuck above 80, river deltas near permit caps, towers at reduced approach, hydro head down 5%. Run the stack against that for 10 consecutive evenings. If it holds, the plan is real. If it doesn't, you don't wish for cooler water, you change the portfolio. That drives a summer market product with teeth. Think of a water-constrained hours strip that prices the blocks when hydrology bites. Generators that harden, hybrid cooling, wastewater tie-ins, verified condenser approach at 86-degree intake, earn higher offers because they clear when others shrink. Demand resources that can shift 2 to 4 hours on 48 hours. Notice get paid like fast start plants. Batteries that commit to discharge across the water alert window are compensated for being the river's relief valve. It's not a new commodity, it's an honest price for August. Meanwhile, the cockpit has to get bigger. Grid operators and water managers can't work from separate calendars. Basin schedules should align reservoir releases within ecological guardrails to blunt the worst hour, not the entire day. A 1-hour pulse at 6 p.m. shaped 2 days in advance can keep hospitals from staggering chillers. In return, utilities commit to pre-cooling that cuts peak withdrawals, keeping thermal plumes inside permits. Minimum flows don't bend. But timing can, and that's the part that saves evenings without breaking rivers. Transmission planning needs a new metric: hours reduced when water constrains generation. A high-voltage DC spine that delivers plains wind into a humid valley at dinner should score on water relief value and move up the queue. Reinforced AC ties that bleed surplus across interfaces during a heat dome count the same way. Cost allocation follows beneficiaries, the metros that stop begging warm rivers for permission. If a line cuts water-constrained hours in 3 load pockets by half, those pockets should carry more of the bill. Put that in the tariff, and steel moves. On the ground, flexibility becomes infrastructure. Tariffs can't be blunt time of use anymore, they have to be weather-aware. When intake thermometers trend up and NOAA flags sticky nights, automated signals nudge building set points, pre-charge chilled water tanks, and queue industrial batches for the shoulder hours. Hospitals get window guarantees they can plan around. Data centers flip to air-side cooling during alerts and discharge thermal storage as if it were generation. Wastewater plants schedule maintenance out of alert blocks. These aren't favors, they're contracted megawatts with performance data and penalties. Permits need to anticipate heat without sacrificing biology. Adaptive frameworks can pre-qualify summer heat protocols months ahead. Verified hybrid cooling curves, wastewater reserves, automatic derate triggers at defined intake temperatures, continuous monitoring with public feeds, and downstream coordination among stacked plants. In exchange, regulators allow minute-by-minute adjustments within a narrow envelope during defined alert periods. No last-minute variances, no panic filings. The river keeps its protections, the plant gets predictability, the operator gets control. Finance will enforce clarity if we write it down. Every major plant should file a hydrology readiness report. 5-year intake temperature history, projected trends, remaining headroom under 316, and state criteria, retrofit plans, and alternate sources, wastewater, air assist, tied to dates. Large new loads, data centers, industrial campuses should do the same. Dual-source cooling plans, thermal storage hours, demand response commitments, and no diesel conditions under water alerts. Publish them. Insurers and lenders will move spreads. Capital will flow to dry reliability. Cities can turn public assets into dispatchable relief. School districts install chilled water tanks, pre-cool at 3 a.m., and ride through dismissal. Public housing signs up for automated pre-cooling with bill protections, avoiding feeder trips and ER visits. Hospitals coordinate or schedules around cooler windows that grid operators reserve and announce days in advance. The megawatts never appear on a generation chart, but they show up when the warm river says, "Not tonight." Operations shift to a rolling clock. A 14-day playbook fuses heat outlooks, reservoir elevations, river temps, and maintenance. Operators stage batteries, call demand blocks, and secure interties before lunch the day the dome forms. Hospitals get a 2-hour window on Thursday. The wastewater plant moves a pump rebuild to Saturday morning. A corridor of stacked plant sequences discharge deltas to avoid laddering a downstream neighbor into a corner. Surprises shrink when everyone behaves like hydrology matters. Governance ties it together. A pre-summer council, grid operators, state energy offices, water agencies, tribes, big loads, sets triggers and roles. Who declares a water alert, which permits flip into adaptive mode, which demand contracts auto-activate, what penalties land if a campus lights diesel outside a test. You don't invent these rules at 4:12 p.m., you rehearse them in May and live them in July. Finally, measure what matters. Post a public water-constrained hours scorecard after each heat wave. Hours saved by transmission, megawatt hours shifted by demand, gallons avoided by reuse, fish stress avoided by coordination. Tie utility earnings and developer incentives to shrinking that number year over year. When the KPI is relief from the river at dusk, portfolios change. None of this is glamorous. It's a set of habits: pricing August honestly, planning with river data, wiring buildings into dispatch, moving steel for water relief, and proving performance under heat. Build that operating system, and heat domes stop being cliffhangers. They become work. And the intake thermometer, still bolted to the pipe and still telling the truth, stops deciding whether a city gets a steady evening or a desperate one. Countdown to 2035, the window for avoiding mass stranding. The clock isn't measured in minutes anymore. It's procurement cycles, permit windows, and crew calendars. 2035 isn't a slogan. It's the edge where today's decisions either show up as reliable, water-light capacity or strand billions in steel that can't run when the river says no. The uncomfortable part is how little slack there is. Every big choice takes years to cross from docket to dispatch screen. Coal goes first because the math is already on the table. Many units face compliance cliffs and weak summer performance against hot water. Retirements cluster between 2028 and 2035. If those stacks come down without a replacement portfolio wired and tested, we trade one risk for another. Cool rivers become empty evenings. The opening is obvious and perishable. Reuse the node while the crews are still on site. Drop storage where the substation already sits. Ring it with solar on ash fields and buffer parcels. Add a dry-cooled flexible unit or a synchronous condenser in the old turbine hall to keep voltage support local. The county keeps the tax base, the grid keeps the inertia and reactive power, and nobody has to beg a warm river at 6 p.m. for a favor. Wait a year and you'll fight interconnection queues and lose the crews to another state. Gas and nuclear sit on a hinge that finance will snap shut by the late 202s. Uprates and life extensions look clean on paper, but summer is the arbiter and cooling is the bottleneck. Owners have 3 moves that matter: commit to hybrid or dry assist retrofits, lock wastewater supply with signed purple pipe contracts, or accept seasonal derates that cut accredited summer capacity and thin revenue exactly when scarcity premiums hit. Lenders are already asking for intake temperature histories, discharge headroom, and retrofit schedules before they front capital for extensions. Units that can prove performance at high intake temps will clear. Units that can't will see risk spreads widen until the maybe becomes a no. Transmission is the long pole in the tent. A backbone HVDC span takes 7 to 12 years from concept to commissioning on a good day. Big AC reinforcements still chew 5 to 8. If desert sun is supposed to land in humid valleys at dinner in 2035, roots need to be real by 2027 and poles in the ground by 2031. That means siting deals in 2026, not 2029. It means cost allocation tied to water relief value, so the metros that stop begging rivers carry their share and sign early. Every year of delay turns into 5 summers of emergency peakers and price spikes downstream. The difference is predictable. Either steel carries dry electrons across weather, or permits carry diesel across a parking lot. Demand growth doesn't wait for comfort. Electrified heat and transport accelerate in the early 2030s. AI and cloud loads are already landing with non-stop profiles and hard uptime guarantees. If utilities don't sequence their build, solar and wind first, storage in lockstep, wires sketched now, load will outrun supply in the same corridors where water already writes the ceiling. The fastest relief isn't another peaker, it's buildings and processes that flatten the hours that cook rivers. Thermal storage in schools and hospitals. Pre-cooling credits that actually pay enough to move set points. Industrial shift programs contracted like capacity, not as favors. Put those in the field by 2028 and you buy room to breathe while wires catch up. Leave them on a slide and August will write your press release. So prioritize like the rivers on the committee. First, triage the thermal fleet by basin. Inland units in moderate-risk watersheds get hybrid cooling and wastewater supply if they can prove performance. Units in high-risk corridors, stacked permits, warm slow rivers, downstream neighbors, get a date certain and a site reuse plan. Coastal or cold sink sites with margin and environmental headroom anchor what's left. Announce decisions early so labor can slide across the fence from retirement work to replacement builds. Second, seize the substation advantage. Every retiring coal site is a ready-made node. Interconnection, roads, land, community buy-in. Lock those sites for solar plus storage, synchronous condensers, and where it makes sense, a dry-cooled, flexible plant. Don't let the fence sit idle and then wonder why the queue is jammed 20 miles away. Right, just transition into the contracts. Local hiring, training seats funded, apprenticeship pipelines tied to project milestones, so the politics stabilize while the electrons do. Third, pick 2 or 3 interregional spines with the highest water relief score and put them on rails. Not 10 lines, 2 or 3 that collapse risk, plains wind to the southeast, desert sun to the mid-south, mountain west to California's shoulder hours. Publish the water-constrained hour reductions, lock beneficiaries, and pre-negotiate wildlife and tribal engagements in public. Make the benefit larger than any single objection and the schedule real enough that investors show up. Fourth, force the market to pay for August by 2027. Seasonal accreditation that reflects hydrology isn't a white paper, it's a tariff. If a megawatt can't show up at dusk under heat without begging a river, it isn't worth a full credit. Tie that to a funded demand portfolio, thermal storage grants, pre-cooling tariffs, industrial shift contracts. That's bid-like capacity and enforced with data. By 2030, those programs should be as routine as spinning reserve. Fifth, require hydrology readiness disclosures from major plants and large new loads by 2026. Intake temperature histories, discharge headroom under 316A and state criteria, retrofit schedules, alternate source contracts, for loads, dual source cooling plans, thermal storage hours, demand response commitments, and no diesel conditions during water alerts. Publish them and let insurers and lenders move spreads. Boards move quickly when premiums and debt costs change. There's a cut line nobody likes to say out loud. Some assets won't make it. A once-through unit on a warming river with stacked downstream neighbors and tight endangered species flows can't clear physics, permits, and finance at the same time. Pretending buys one quiet summer and guarantees a louder one later. Announce the retirement, attach a reuse package, and move the crews to what replaces it. The worst outcome is a surprise in August with a lawsuit attached. People are the final constraint. Procurement teams have to stop buying projects and start buying portfolios. Solar here, wind there, storage at both ends, wires binding them, buildings committed to flex. Regulators need to allow multi-year, multi-asset approvals tied to measured reductions in water-constrained hours, not just lowest first cost. City councils have to say yes to purple pipe and chilled water tanks, not because they're glamorous, but because they keep clinics cold when rivers won't. We don't need a miracle, we need a sequence. Decide which plants harden and which bow out. Reuse the nodes before they rust. Lock the 2 or 3 big lines that change August. Fund the dry megawatts hiding in schools, hospitals, and factories. Bake water into accreditation so portfolios tilt toward what shows up without a river. Do that by 2035 and we dodge mass stranding of assets, of hometowns, and of the idea that the grid is something you can trust at dinner. Miss the window, and we'll spend the late 203s writing checks to diesel suppliers and lawyers, while a thermometer in a river decides our evenings. The meaning and the choice. Lake Powell hits minimum power pool by October 2026. Hoover Dam loses 70% capacity by May 2027. The grid either hardens by 2035 or breaks. There's no third option, and the clock isn't ticking, it's counting down. If you want to see where this breaks first, and who's already fixing it, watch the next episode with the live risk map and real playbook cities are using right now. Subscribe to GeoQuest for the untold infrastructure stories that cut past hype and land on decisions that still matter.